Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and speak to this bill, which we tabled in the last session. And the title is surprisingly relevant today, Equity and Sustainability in Electrical Utilities Act. We've been talking a lot about utilities, and recent government actions have shone light on our need to reform our relationship with Nova Scotia Power. I don't think that we would find anyone who would disagree with the idea that we need to reform that relationship. High power rates, high profits at the company need to be addressed, but Mr. Speaker, they need to be addressed systematically. And I think that what we are seeing right now is the opposite of a systemic, thoughtful intervention in what is happening with power rates. And more importantly, what is happening with the bills people pay and the way that our power regulatory system is structured. What we have seen, what we see on the floor of the legislature right now is an 11th hour intervention that essentially kneecaps an independent regulatory process. What we have been advocating for and what we advocate for in this bill is in fact a change in the regulatory process. The UARB is an independent regulator, but it is what we call a creature of statute. It is created by ostensibly this legislature through legislation. And so we can determine how it regulates, but then we need to set it free to do the regulation at arm's length, something this government is clearly not interested in, and this is just the latest example. We have put forward a slew of ideas of how to accomplish this. One of them is a performance-based regulatory system, a system that in fact incentivizes ecological sustainability, that incentivizes clean energy, because as most members know, right now, Nova Scotia Power is incentivized to do one thing: sell power. And so as we reduce our need for power in certain ways through efficiency, in fact, that is at direct cross purposes with Nova Scotia Power's raison d'etre. They exist to sell power, and that's fine. They're a private company. That's their business model. But we are a government, and we are responsible to ensure that everyone in this province has access to the power that they sell, because Madam Speaker, this is not a choice in our climate. You can't live without power. I mean, some very hardy souls do live off-grid in this climate, but I would suspect that almost all of them have access to some kind of alternative energy source. And that's great, but right now, to do that at scale is very difficult. This bill requires Nova Scotia Power to consider climate change target reductions in its work, something that it is not now required to do. We know that this government talks a lot about the environmental, what's called now the environmental ECRA. Goals and the Environmental Goals and Climate Change something Accountability Act. So that's great. We've got goals. But those goals will only take us so far. We need action. And so that is one of the things that this bill attempts to do. We've heard from advocates recently, such as Bill Mahody, who's the consumer advocate, about the importance of independence of the UARB and concerns about recent government overreach. Rate setting for Nova Scotia Power is very complicated. I don't know how many people have had the privilege of sitting through one of those hearings. I have done part of it. It is incredibly complex regulatory law. And one of the things that's important is the independence of this process. And one of the reasons that that's important is because otherwise the company doesn't have access to low-cost financing. I think it's really important to understand that one of the things that the UARB cannot do right now is to set up a universal service program. And that's really at the heart of what we think would be a systemic intervention in the UARB process. So right now, according to legislation, the UARB cannot discriminate within a rate class. So all consumers need to pay the same amount. There's no choice. The UARB would be breaking the law to mandate that consumers pay different amounts. But we know that not all consumers are the same. This government is talking at great length about targeted interventions. They know that there are people that cannot afford power. And so a universal service program says that the UARB is enabled, that they may create a different way of charging low-income Nova Scotians in particular. And so just as we, in the NDP caucus anyway, and the Canada Housing and Mortgage Corporation, although maybe not the Nova Scotia Progressive Conservatives, recognize that affordable housing means 30% of your income, it is also widely recognized that affordable power means 6% of your income. That's the test. And so what we are suggesting is that for Nova Scotians, for whom a power bill is more than 6% of their incomes, should be accommodated by the UARB such that they can afford power. Put simply, I mean, this to me, we have brought forward 2 bills today that we actually think are entirely uncontroversial. They are not ideological. They're not meant to pin the government in one way or another. They're actually just meant to help people. We have spent all of this session and most of the last session trying to raise the alarms about the impact of the cost of living crisis on Nova Scotians. There are so many in this province who are struggling to afford medication, who are struggling to afford power, who are struggling to afford groceries, who have a hard time putting gas in the tank. And you know what? We want to be positive too. This government does not have a lease on positivity, and they certainly don't have a lease on compassion. And that is what we're doing here. We are demonstrating our compassion by saying, doesn't everyone deserve the same opportunity right now? We are not all in the same boat. We are in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And for some people, paying your power bill is an inconvenience. For some people, picking up your prescription makes you think twice about your bank balance. And for other people, it's impossible. And so for those people, we are saying, please consider this bill. Consider a strategic, smart, useful intervention in the regulatory process. When the government comes in with a bill like the one on the order paper now, 212, and cuts the legs out from under a regulatory process that is just about to wrap up, there are massive repercussions, known and unknown. And it gives the Nova Scotia Power a certain kind of authority where they can stand up in law amendments and say, well, then we're going to break the law. We're not going to meet our 2030 targets. We're going to break the law. Why would we do that? We have Nova Scotia Power and the Consumer Advocate, who by all accounts are on very opposite sides of the table, saying the same thing. This would not get that kind of reaction. I promise you, Madam Speaker, it wouldn't. Because you would have an overwhelming number of people who would say, well, that makes sense. It makes sense that people should afford to be able to turn the lights on. It makes sense that everyone should afford to be able to turn on their stove or turn on the thermostat, just like it makes sense that everybody should deserve a roof over their head. So, you know, I've spoken a lot about the Universal Service Program, but as I said, this bill would also create a sustainability advocate. There is a lot that can be done to reform our regulatory environment to make sure that people have access to power, that people have access to the things they need. But it is a complex environment with difficult dynamics. We are in an inflationary environment. We still burn, most of our electricity still comes from coal. We desperately need to change that, and we need to build the jobs that come with that transition. But this is too important for a reactionary piece of legislation with a ton of unintended consequences. Nova Scotia Power's profits are too high. Our bills are too high. Our service is unreliable. And I think it's uncontroversial to say that the model is broken. But, Madam Speaker, it's time to take a look at permanent fixes that will make life more affordable for Nova Scotians and protect the environment. Thank you.